Deep breath. This is a big one. Ketogenic diets for cycling performance, the future of elite endurance sport? Most of you listening to this will understand exactly why this is a big one. When I first thought about launching this podcast, I had many names in my mind. Some of them ended up being guests much earlier than I expected, and today is an example of that. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are indeed interviewing Professor Louise Burke to talk about her work with the low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diets in cycling, where we'll be discussing if this is indeed the future of elite endurance sports. Believe me when I say that you don't want to miss this episode number 33, Ketogenic Diets for Cycling Performance. This is part one of a 2-episode series with Professor Louise. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal podcast. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fuel the Pedal podcast, that one podcast on nutrition for cycling and endurance sports with an occasional twist. Once again, I am your host, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese nutritionist broadcasting from Madrid. It's great to have you on that side listening to my ramblings, and if this is the first time you're tuning in, allow me to give you an even warmer welcome. I hope you find these contents useful for your practice, whether if you're a nutritionist colleague, a coach, or a cyclist looking for information on this controversial topic. I hope you've enjoyed the previous episode number 32 with Professor Andrew Jones on the latest evidence on the use of beetroot juice and nitrates for cyclists and other endurance athletes. And today's topic really is a controversial one, and I bet my chances in saying that there are indeed topics that are controversial in sports nutrition, and then there's the ketogenic diet. This is perhaps at the moment, alongside with the whole debate of plant versus omnivorous diets, one of the most, if not the most controversial topic in the sports nutrition field, and I couldn't think of anyone most suited to talk about this than Professor Louise Burke, due to her work in the past few years with elite racewalkers while comparing different diet protocols, mostly high carbohydrate diets, periodized carbohydrate diets, and low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diets in markers of performance, substrate oxidation, exercise economy, bone metabolism, and even oral microbiota, in particular the nitrate-reducing bacteria playing an important role in the ergogenic benefit from nitrate supplementation. Now, you will hear this episode in 2 parts. This is part 1, and today we'll be focusing our attention in some of the more basic aspects of the ketogenic diet, starting with the focus on the black or white approaches and why are we living in a current state of diet wars, and why does this topic generate so much social media noise and antagonistic positions on the Twitter sphere. We are going to be talking about some of Professor Louise Burke research on this topic and many other findings throughout the years leading up to what we know today about the use of ketogenic diets in endurance athletes and the possible applications it may have. On part 2, we'll be digging deeper on other novel areas regarding the ketogenic diets in endurance athletes, such as their impact in the oral microbiota of athletes, bone metabolism, and even on the use of exogenous ketones on top of a high carbohydrate diet as performed in recent research. In addition to this, it will be interesting to hear from Professor Louise what was the feedback from the athletes themselves while undergoing the performance tests during their respective training camps, since they were the ones feeling the effects firsthand. So stay tuned for episode 2 coming soon. And before getting into today's episode, I would please ask you to try and rate Fuel the Pedal podcast and leave a short review on Apple Podcasts if you're using this app to listen to it. And for that, you just have to open Apple Podcasts app, search for Fuel the Pedal, and once you find it, click on it, scroll down all the way to the bottom until you see the space for the review. It would mean a lot and it would help the podcast grow if you could just leave your honest review of the show, especially if you've been listening to it for a while now. But more than anything, I'm just glad that you're here listening to this, and from my part, I will keep on trying to translate science into practice as best as I possibly can while interviewing the true experts on their respective fields. And now, without further delay, it's time for part 1 of this episode 33, Ketogenic Diets for Cycling Performance, the future of elite endurance sports, with the one and only Professor Louise Burke from the Australian Catholic University. Up next on Fuel the Pedal podcast. Hello, Professor Louise. It's just incredible to have you here with us on Fuel the Pedal. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, and I'm pleased to be here.
Well, I'm pleased to have you here as well. Thank you so much for your time and willingness to be here. I truly appreciate it. It's an absolute honor and privilege to have you on Fuel the Pedal and just have the opportunity to chat with you about this, really. We have quite a journey ahead of us and just so many things to talk about regarding this topic. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
I am really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you because I think you really get the importance of what we do in trying to marry science and practice and always think about the translation to the real world.
Thank you for your kind words, Professor. It really means a lot coming from you. And that really is the ultimate goal of this podcast, really. And hopefully we can give a solid contribution for a better understanding of the current knowledge of the use of ketogenic diets for endurance performance. So, yeah, really excited to have some of your thoughts on the many misconceptions around this topic. But before that, if we look at your Twitter profile, you define yourself as an embracer of sports science, a lover of all CH things, chocolate, Chanel, and champagne, and ever a hopeful Saints fan. But besides this lovely presentation, and needless to say that the vast majority of the listeners are perfectly aware of who you are, how would you present yourself to the world and the work you've been performing throughout your vast experience in the area of sports nutrition?
Look, I consider myself extremely lucky to have had the career and the experiences that I have. I have had a lot of my opportunities by complete accident, and I'm the product of a lot of other people's kindnesses, both in allowing me to be able to do some of the work that I've done and meet other people who've been, really generous with their time and their knowledge. And now I'm the recipient of the generosity of a lot of really young sports scientists who are so giving and generous and clever and creative, and I get to be the orchestra leader on some of the new projects that we're doing and get to often take the credit for all their wonderful work. But I've just had the most amazing career, and I hadn't realised until recently just how lucky I've been to be able to work beside some of the best coaches and some of the best athletes in the world, and just understand what makes their minds tick and all the really clever, insightful things that they know about human performance. And it's so different to see it in real life than it is to hear about it from a textbook or from, the sort of the black and white view that often we get presented with. It's the real world of human performance and how our limits can be beaten is just really fascinating.
For sure, that really is fascinating, and it has truly translated to your research contributions to this area. And we'll be touching on some of those black or white views on the topic. But before that, Professor Louise, we've all witnessed the Australian Institute of Sport's announcement that you were leaving that organization. I wonder, how has this process been for you so far?
Look, it's been really sad. I've had the most wonderful 30 years there, and I've loved every moment of it, but it's been through a whole different set of changes in the last couple of years, and I've realised that the best environment for me to work now is where I'm now full-time at Australian Catholic University. They've been incredibly generous and with the resources and the support they've given me for research, and so I think the final phase of my career will still be working with elite athletes, but really trying to spend more time in the research environment so that I can hone some of the things that I've learned and try and push the limits a little bit more and help our understanding of what sports nutrition can do to make athletes go higher, faster, stronger. It's not something that I thought at the beginning of my career that I would do. I've never seen myself as a researcher. I mean, I'm a hobbyist, if you like, as a researcher, in that I've been looking at research as a way of finding an evidence base for practice. But the more recent years, I've had so much wonderful support from Australian Catholic University and the environment of the AIS to be able to do these really wonderful studies, really complicated, big, hairy projects we've called our Supernova series and others. And I'd like to think that that's something I'll be able to do for the next phase of my career, being able to involve coaches and athletes as co-researchers and really push the boundaries of what we can do in applied sports nutrition research.
Yes, I'm sure you'll find a way to reinvent yourself and shine elsewhere. And it was just great to see many researchers throughout social media thanking you for your precious contribution over the years. And for the sakes of sports nutrition research, hopefully we can still count on you to keep on pushing forward. So allow me as a nutritionist to extend my deepest thanks to the work you've been performing so far. We'll be surely keep on hearing from you. So before getting into the hows and whys regarding this topic, I'm really interested in knowing what has motivated you to start researching about the effects of ketogenic diet and its impact on exercise performance in these athletes as part of the Supernova series.
Well, I always try and look at new ideas and think through them from the point of view of what is the hypothesis behind it and what are some of the anecdotes or testimonials or ideas that we're hearing from practice. And then if we feel that there's both some evidence from the field as well as a good hypothesis behind it, then it behoves us all to go and have a look at it in a real life research setting. We can't be closed-minded and thinking, well, we tried that before and it didn't work, or there's no evidence behind it. If there's a reasonable hypothesis and we've got people interested in it, and certainly some practice from the field that might suggest that it has some benefits, then I think we have to really go in and test it rigorously rather than just make up our minds from what the black and white says at the moment.
No doubt. And Professor Louise, this is a question I've made to some of the previous guests here on the show. You, alongside with many other researchers on this field, such as Trent Sellingworth, James Morton, Graham Close, and your husband John Hawley, you are all examples of researchers who are not only in the lab, but in the field as well. Something that has also happened with the Supernova project, with all the athletes that were engaged into all the experiments you've performed. So how important do you believe this is when designing applied scientific research and translating data into real-life scenarios?
Well, obviously I'm biased because I think it's really crucial. And, I think it depends on why you're doing research and whether your interest is in just, how the human body works, or whether exercise may have some health benefits or, physiological benefits. But, when I'm working in my field, it's all about athletes at the very high performance end and making them be able to win gold medals. And so I have a very, very specific view of sports nutrition and what's in it for me. And so I think you need to be able to work in the trenches and understand what sport is really like. There's a big difference between how textbooks describe events and how they're played out in real life. And sometimes you need to be in the trenches and see what real athletes do and what the limitations, both physiologically and in practical forms as well, so that you can tailor the sports nutrition strategy to really meet their needs that can be implemented in their environment.
No, I couldn't agree more. And this ongoing scenario of diet wars really is intense around the ketogenic diet and quite damaging, I would say. Why do you believe there is this current state of diet wars and black or white approaches that have been increasing in the past few years, and in this particular context of endurance exercise and ketogenic diets?
Oh, there's so many complicated reasons for it, and I think it's part of just our general society at the moment that, and you've brought out that social media has such an effect on being able to amplify voices and to make them really globally available. But we seem to be stuck in a moment where everything is black and white, and it's not just about nutrition, but something about nutrition is common to us all. We all eat, and so even though we may not feel that we could talk about climate change or, physics or vaccines from a knowledge point of view with expertise, I think nutrition is something that everybody feels that they have some expertise to offer just simply because they eat and they observe what happens to themselves. And so we've been given a platform to be able to shout to the rooftops about our own ideas, and unfortunately, it's an interesting concept that there's only one way of doing things, in the same way that religion has been sort of promoting that there's only one true God. So we have to only have one true version of what nutrition is. But the interesting thing, I mean, one of the reasons why humans are the apex predators in our world, or the most, the most able kind of creatures, is that we are flexible and we can survive doing a number of different things. And so I don't think there's one only successful way of doing things that we see all around the world, even though we talk about a paleo diet or, what people eat for success. In every country that you could look at in terms of ancestry, there are different models of what people ate and were successful. And so that's our hallmark as humans, that we can adapt to our environment in the most incredible ways. And so I think we have to be careful in thinking that there's only one diet or one dietary approach that's going to be successful for everything. And we need to be open-minded about saying that we're the only people that know the truth.
Indeed, that really is the way nutrition has been faced over this past decade, and guest after guest coming here to the podcast, we always come down to the same conclusion, which is that although we are entitled to an opinion, not all of us are qualified to give such opinion. And regarding this topic, there are just so many people blindly believing that the ketogenic diet is the ultimate and only way to increase your health or improve your performance, just because they follow this group of popular people on Twitter or even other podcasts exclusively around the topic of the ketogenic diet. And we sort of keep on failing to see the context and the limitations of whatever approach it is. And this can completely stall progress when we have a group of athletes in front of us and things need to be adapted according to the type of training, the season objectives, and the engine of each athlete, which in the case of cyclists varies enormously between riders of different specialties. So that just for the listeners to have a better understanding about this, perhaps it would be a good starting ground to define nutritionally what exactly is the ketogenic diet and why and how has it generated so much social media noise and defensive positions regarding its effects on health, weight loss, and exercise performance.
Yes, so my understanding of the ketogenic diet really is mostly focused on the way it's been practiced in sports nutrition, and my first introduction to it was from the 1983 paper by Steve Finney and colleagues. And I can remember, reading it as a really newly qualified dietitian and being gobsmacked by just the creativity and the care and the rigour with which the project was done. And it really challenged me to think differently about sports nutrition and also just, what I understood about physiology, because I remember looking at the study and you're seeing that these cyclists had been put on what we would have considered at that time to be a really unsuitable diet for athletes, that it was a very strict, very low carbohydrate diet. In the first instance, it was less than 20 grams a day of carbohydrates. So it really removed from the diet a lot of foods that you wouldn't think of as being really high in carbohydrate. Even things like dairy and nuts, etc., contain a small amount of carbohydrate. So you have to limit your intake of even those foods on the diet. But I would have thought back then as a young dietitian that if you removed all the carbohydrate from your diet as far as you could, then you would not be able to synthesize glycogen in the muscle without the carbohydrate precursors from your diet. And yet in the paper it showed that the cyclists after a period were able to store some glycogen. It was much less than when they were consuming the high carbohydrate diet at the beginning of the study. But it made me realise that the body has ways in which it can convert different metabolites into glycogen, because it's such an important fuel source, and that there's ways in which our bodies are clever in being able to provide us with some of the things that we need from other sources. So this study challenged both my idea of how fuel could be stored in the muscle from precursors, but also how it could be used during exercise, because after the 4 weeks of this study, the cyclists were able to continue their exercise at a moderate intensity, but for the same period of time, the same duration as when they'd been on a high carbohydrate diet, where we would have predicted from everything that we thought about sports nutrition at the time that they should have been prematurely fatigued because they would have run out of glycogen and not been able to provide the fuel to keep exercising. So that really challenged my thoughts at the time and recognised that the body could adapt and learn to burn more fat and make use of a less limited fuel source. But that study was really, I guess, focused on very moderate intensity exercise. So although it showed some remarkable physiological outcomes that I hadn't expected, when I then tried to translate it to athletes with whom I was working, it really wasn't providing the kind of benefits that were important, because when I was working with elite athletes in endurance events, they were conducted at much higher intensities. And this study also showed as one of its outcomes that the price that the body paid for being better able to burn fat was some limitation on your ability to work at higher intensities that were more carbohydrate dependent. So even back then we saw some clues, and I remember thinking, well, that study is really fascinating from a physiological perspective, but in terms of translation to athletes with whom I worked, there wasn't really a use for it. And I thought that put it in the back of my mind, that might be more useful if I was ever to work with athletes who did much more moderate intensity but much longer events where there wasn't the capacity to be able to take in extra carbohydrate to keep the fuel supply coming from that source. So that was, very early on in my career. And one of the interesting things that had happened in about 2013 or 14 was suddenly this diet's back in vogue again, and yet there'd been no more studies published in peer-reviewed press that I'd seen, and yet there was a lot of talk about it. And maybe it was the social media amplification of things, but when we listened to some of the testimonials that were coming from athletes, typically ultra-endurance athletes rather than endurance, but there still was such a noise being made about the diet that maybe there was something that we'd missed previously, that I felt the necessity to go back and have a look. And it fitted in because at that stage we were not just interested in the ketogenic diet when we did our first lot of studies, but by this stage the sports nutrition guidelines had changed from promoting high carbohydrate diets for endurance athletes full stop, but rather this idea that you needed to periodise carbohydrate both to match what the requirements for competition were to the intake at the time, but also to allow or even promote at sometimes during the training phase that you would deliberately train with low carbohydrate availability as a way of amplifying the training response. And so we were much more interested in this idea of changing carbohydrate availability rather than maximising it at all times. And it seemed a good opportunity to be able then to compare the traditional high carbohydrate at all times with this periodised approach and then the totally restricted carbohydrate. And so that was the basis of our first study, being able to look at three different ways of approaching carbohydrate and endurance performance.
That was just a fantastic historical overview of the topic regarding how the previous and much older guidelines aimed at a chronic high carbohydrate diet for athletes, how it then transitioned to the periodized carbohydrate approach we now have. And since my next question would be to ask you to sum up the findings of the last 5 to 10 years, I believe we've just killed two birds with one stone. There are just a couple of important points you've mentioned there that I would highlight for the listeners. And the first one would be regarding that seminal research from Finney, where you saw that the body is still able to store some glycogen in the absence of carbohydrate by using other substrates for this conversion. And the other point would be the price that the body pays to have this increased capacity to oxidize fat, which is a limitation to be able to work at higher intensities. And this leads precisely to the next point I intended to ask you, and that I believe is central in today's discussion. So our talk here today is around performance, in particular on how to sustain the highest pace or wattage or whatever intensity related parameter is most defining of being faster and being able to sustain that intensity for as long as possible, which is in most endurance sports what leads to winning. And often when talking about ketogenic diets and endurance exercise, and please Professor Louise, do jump in at any moment if I say something inaccurate, the problem starts with the definition of endurance exercise and the non-differentiation between high intensity endurance exercise and the simplistic view of exercise undertaken at 60 to 80% of VO2 max under the premise of unlimited fat stores. And this is where perhaps basic biochemistry comes into play, because we are not worried only in generating ATP, but rather to generate it as fast as possible to match the intensity demands of that particular moment. Professor Louise, would you agree that there is often some confusion around this assumption around exercise intensities when in a state of ketosis?
Yes, so I think there's a couple of different things. The first is that people, when they think about exercise, endurance exercise from a textbook, haven't recognised that when you say there's a band in which it falls in terms of intensity from 60 to 80%, I mean, that might sound like it's pretty similar, but of course, physiologically, there's quite a difference between exercise that's carried out at those modest intensities and the higher intensity pieces. And people don't recognise that elite endurance athletes have this remarkable capacity to work at very high rates of output, both from absolute and relative intensities. And so, when you see marathon runners, especially those at the top end, who are trying to break 2 hours, people don't recognise how fast they're moving, both in terms of absolute speed, but also relative to their VO2 max. And I've been to a couple of marathons where some of the shoe companies will bring a treadmill along as a bit of a publicity thing, and they'll set the treadmill at the speed that the top runners are working at and invite someone from the crowd to hop on and see how long they can last. And they're usually spat out the back of the treadmill within about a minute, because people really have no concept of just how fast, how much energy production is going into even what sounds like an endurance event that is in fat burning zones, if you like, from the point of view of the average punter. Mm-hmm. And so when you are dealing with high performance athletes and elite athletes, you really are talking about how fast energy can be generated, but often also the ability to move within intensities really quickly, because in lots of events there's tactics, or some of the events involve changes in terrain. And so in cycling, probably the poster child for this sort of effect, where you need to be able to suddenly change intensity according to what's happening in the race in terms of tactics, or what's happening in terms of hills and what have you. And so the successful athletes are those that can change suddenly, make the race change from one exercise intensity to another, which involves great physiological changes, but particularly fuel use. And so this idea of metabolic flexibility, of being able to quickly be able to change between physiological pathways and fuel substrates is a hallmark of what makes an elite athlete successful. And that's been one of the things, I think, at the bottom of why we think, or at least in our hands, the ketogenic diet doesn't have the capacity to support elite athletes and their needs, as well as some of the devotees of the ketogenic diet think.
And that brings us precisely to the next topic, which is metabolic flexibility. And this one is precisely one of the main claims advocated by the ketogenic diet followers: an enhanced metabolic flexibility in endurance athletes when reaching the so-called fat-adapted state. And these two terms have become quite mainstream by those who follow and support a ketogenic diet. We could perhaps define metabolic flexibility as the ability to efficiently adapt the metabolism according to substrate sensing, storage, utilization depending on availability and requirement. And you just gave a brilliant example when talking about cyclists and the ability to be able to change intensities during a race. And this is somewhat linked to previous episodes here on the podcast with Dr. James Morton, Dr. Sam Impey, and also with your former PhD student, now Dr. Ida Eikura, on nutrition interventions to enhance training adaptations through metabolic signaling with low availability of a carbohydrate that I invite you to take a look at. And this is, of course, extremely relevant to cyclists. So my question here would be, is there a true fat-adapted state as often claimed by those following a ketogenic diet? And does following a ketogenic diet for an X amount of time truly increases metabolic flexibility to a further extent?
Well, the way that I see it, it doesn't, because what we're seeing is that the cost of being fat-adapted on the ketogenic diet is that it impairs your ability to use carbohydrate at high intensities, even when it's available and stored in the muscle. So it's really, in our hands at least, cutting out that top gear, that ability to work at these very high intensities supported by carbohydrate oxidation. And that's the gear that is really so important for success in many of the endurance events that I work with, or the athletes with whom I work. So it seems to me that the ketogenic diet has more of a target towards the ultra endurance races where there's a much lower intensity overall, and in which perhaps there's less requirement for higher intensity stages, and particularly if there's some sort of an event in where it's difficult for the individual or for the event to allow an athlete to take in extra carbohydrate. Sure. So in those events, I have no problem with the idea that fat could become a much more useful fuel source, and when there's limitations on providing carbohydrate, then it would make sense to be better able to utilise fat. But as I said, I can see differences in application for different sorts of diets, but because the work that I do is very heavily concentrated on the endurance side and on the ability to have that extra gear, or that ability to switch between still high but much higher intensity exercise, I'm reluctant to give up that gear. It doesn't make sense to me to sacrifice that in terms of performance.
I like how you insist on that last gear, really representing that higher limit of intensity that gets compromised with a ketogenic diet. But I also like how you've been also insisting on indicating that in scenarios where intensity is perhaps lower, or when carbohydrate provision in terms of snacks, gels or bars is limited, ketogenic diet could perhaps be used. And I struggle with this because we are not here to take sides. If there's any approach that results in an advantage for the athlete, we as nutritionists or researchers would be the first ones to go forth and apply it or study it further. And you've certainly insisted on studying this issue with your athletes in several parameters. Put simply, if there's evidence, for example, showing that beta-alanine works, we are not going to create opposite factions that defend beta-alanine and another one that attacks it, but rather try and understand in which scenarios or intensity it works, or which cycling specialties does it benefit in this case. But that surely isn't the case with the ketogenic diet. It's all or nothing, and it's a shame. It doesn't benefit progress, nor the athletes, only the people's ego. And we will perhaps go back to this issue many times during our talk today, but it's just overwhelming the difference between the levels of appreciation for research like this when you post it on Twitter, for example, with people saying that you are deliberately sabotaging the studies for not going long enough, which maybe is a comment made by someone who has never set a foot on academia or lab and understand the challenges of doing such research. So, Professor Louise, what would you say about such postures?
Well, look, we got a lot of criticism for the first study, and yet when we did it, or when we started the study, there were no other studies to compare it to apart from the Finney study, and that had clearly shown and made conclusions that 3 to 4 weeks was enough to adapt an athlete to a ketogenic diet. We also based our study on the more recent popular book by Jeff Volek and Steve Finney on the art and science of low carb performance. And in that book, it had said that it takes 2 to 3 weeks to adapt to the ketogenic diet and to improve performance. So our first study was simply copying what had been done previously, and we actually followed the book religiously to try and maximise our effect and see the possibility that the ketogenic diet might enhance performance. So it was a bit disappointing then to be trolled on social media, being told that I was either too dumb to understand that I needed to go longer, or I had deliberately sabotaged the study to make it short enough so that we didn't achieve the adaptation. But look, you have to take things on the chin and just not worry too much about what social media has said. And then since then, we've had opportunities to do more studies. And of course, we'd love to do the study that went for 6 months or 12 months or however long it might take to satisfy our detractors. But that's just not possible with the group of athletes with whom I work and the sort of resources that we have. We have prided ourselves on being completely rigorous with the way that we've implemented the diets and the training and monitored them. And, when I'm working with world-class athletes, particularly in an Olympic year, they're very generous to give up a month's time. And so, we've tried to make the best of our ability to use that time to investigate the ketogenic diet, and not just from the point of view of performance, but also from the point of view of understanding more about the basis of what's happening and trying to understand the adaptation and other physiological effects. We would like to do some sort of investigation of longer term adaptation, because I'm completely open to the idea that I can learn new things and evolve our thinking. But we think the way forward with that would be more to look at a cross-sectional investigation of athletes who've chosen to be on ketogenic diets for longer periods, rather than try an intervention study and follow them over that period. So if COVID allows us to get back to the lab and to be able to do testing and have people all together in research situations again, we hope to do that. But for the moment, I'm quite satisfied that we've done the best job that we can do with the opportunities and resources that we've had, and certainly the cooperation of athletes to look at things. And so if we're looking at shorter periods of time, we've certainly seen that adaptation in terms of being able to increase fat oxidation by the muscle to the highest levels ever seen. So we've not had a limitation on that aspect of the adaptation. If there are other things that are happening with longer-term ketogenesis, then we may have to use different techniques to find them. But we've certainly had a look at what happens in the short term, and we've also looked at ways of which we can try and periodise the ketogenic diet with a return to high carbohydrate availability, to see if we can find the best of both worlds, where the metabolic flexibility might be provided by having fat adaptation in the background, but then restoring carbohydrate availability. So we've had a couple of different attempts to try those models, because as I said, I'm always looking for a way in which I can try and make it work.
Yes, and I believe this is also a matter of our narrative fitting into people's bias, and if it doesn't fit their bias, then no study will ever be long enough. They will just keep on criticizing until it matches their beliefs and feeds their ego a bit more. But anyway, we'll have an opportunity to get into the matter you've just mentioned regarding periodizing a ketogenic diet and then return to a high carbohydrate availability to sort of find the best of both worlds if such scenario reveals to be beneficial for the athlete. But before that, there's plenty of research from your lab that we could get into, but I would like to start with one of your studies in the Supernova series performed with elite racewalkers during a 3.5 week of intensified training controlled diet with high carbohydrate, periodized carbohydrate, and a low carb, high fat diet, looking at metabolism and performance. There are many things we could discuss about this study, but one thing that really caught my attention and that I think it's central to our discussion today was the reduced economy and increased oxygen demand of the subjects in the low carb, high fat group. So starting with this increased oxygen cost of exercise, Could you tell us a bit more about this research and the possible implications that may exist for athletes from other endurance sports such as cyclists?
Yes, so look, this was something that I didn't think about at the time when we did the first study. We hadn't talked about it and hadn't seen it written anywhere else. But we always think about fuels in terms of how many calories or how much ATP they could produce per gram of the substrate. And of course, fat is a much more energy-dense fuel, and so you always think of it as having more capacity to produce energy. But when you're thinking about these fuels being oxidised, burning with oxygen, the issue is not just how much a gram of the substrate can produce in terms of ATP, but it's how much oxygen. And so when we look at the amount of oxygen that's required to produce ATP, that's when we see a difference in the economy, if you like, of the different fuels. And I remember when we first got our data back from Supernova and we're looking at them, and we use a bespoke metabolic cart at the AIS. We have our own equipment, and we've got much more control over things. I mean, we handle data and look at it critically. And when we looked at the results from the first study, I said, that looks odd. The oxygen cost or the oxygen rates seem to be higher in the ketogenic group. Could we better just go back and check that we haven't written down things wrongly or done something incorrectly? When we had a look, it was obvious that there was just this consistently higher amount of oxygen that was being used to run or to walk at the same speed when the athletes had been on the keto diet. And I spoke about this to one of my colleagues, Ron Morn, who's a very famous physiologist, and he's older than I am and has come through a classical physiology background. And he looked at me in a very disappointed way and he said, you know, of course, that we've known this for 100 years, even back at the beginning of the century when the first studies were done looking at exercise and fuel substrate utilisation, people could measure that there was a difference in the amount of ATP or calories that you could produce from the different fuel substrates on the basis of the amount of oxygen that was used. And he said, in fact, back in the old days before we had metabolic carts that did things automatically, it took a whole day to do a VO2 max test because you had Douglas bags, then you had to run the gas analysis through Haldane metabolic carts, and so it took a long time and you looked at a lot of numbers, and the way that we knew that we hadn't made a mistake was that we could see that it cost more oxygen to burn more fat than it did carbohydrate, and there was about a 5 to 8% difference. And when the numbers showed you that, then you knew you'd done your work right. And it's only now we understand why, because we understand the physiological pathways or the biochemical pathways of energy production, and you can write those pathways and you can look at all the ATP that comes out at different points and the oxygen that goes in, and you can look at the reducing equivalents and put them through the electron transport chain and count up the amount of ATPs that are produced per molecule of oxygen involved in these reactions, and that's explaining the difference. And it works out that depending on the starting point of both the fat or the carbohydrate, there is about a 5 to 8% difference in the ATP production per mole of oxygen that's used, and carbohydrates more efficient at producing ATP for a smaller oxygen cost. And so when people say to me, we haven't got long enough to adapt on our diets, I think, well, why would it make any difference if you went longer? You're talking about fundamental biochemical pathways, and so that explained to us why there's a difference in the oxygen cost from what we saw. But in terms of then translating that to sports performance, one of the things when you are working with athletes who work at very high maximal oxygen capacity is that probably what becomes limiting is not the substrate. It's not that you haven't got enough carbohydrate or fat, but the delivery of the oxygen into the mitochondria and the ability to oxidize those fuels suddenly becomes limiting. So when you're working at 60% of VO2 max, you've got lots of redundancy in the system, if you like. You've got lots of ability to work at 63% of VO2 max if you need to burn more oxygen to use fat. But when you're at the very higher intensities, around the so-called anaerobic threshold, around 80 to 85% and above VO2 max, then how much ATP you're producing for the oxygen you can get to the mitochondria becomes really important. And that's where we think the problem lies in the ketogenic diet, is that you just don't have the ability to provide more oxygen to use more fat as a fuel, even if on paper you can do it. So that's why we think that there is a limitation. And of course, when you talk to coaches, they know that intuitively. I mean, the reason that they do a lot of the sorts of training that they do is to improve the economy of an athlete, to allow them to move at the same speed for a lower oxygen cost. Because if they can do that, that means that they can go up another notch, if you like, to work at the same oxygen cost, but now they're able to go faster. And some of the better athletes are those that are more economical. Like the best endurance athletes certainly have a high VO2 max, but they're also very good at being able to move at a very high speed for any percentage of that high capacity. And so you need to have all those attributes to be really successful. The ability to be able to deliver oxygen to the mitochondria, and then to produce a lot of ATP for the fuels that you can burn to move you forward.
Yes, and this certainly doesn't match the claim of higher metabolic flexibility while on a ketogenic diet. Otherwise, there would be no limitation in terms of oxygen delivery when exercising or competing at really higher intensities, or closer to that anaerobic threshold that defines success in cycling and many other decisive moments in other endurance events. And regarding the subject of metabolic flexibility, I remember when Professor James Morton was here on the podcast giving the example of Chris Froome and how he could train for hours with no carbohydrate at all in some particular sessions. But then, when it was needed, he was also able to perform at extremely high intensities while consuming enormous amounts of carbohydrate in race day. And Team Sky released that data showing Chris Froome's dietary intake in a less demanding day during the 2018 Giro d'Italia when compared to the stage 19, where he reached 96 grams per hour of carbohydrates with a total of close to 19 grams per kilo of carbohydrate on that day alone. But I also remember that a year before that, Chris Froome was posting images of some low carbohydrate meals consisting of poached eggs with salmon and avocado, and the low carb ketogenic community got all riled up saying that he was winning so many races thanks to a low carb ketogenic diet. But he was just posting low carb days or meals as part of a periodized approach. He then had to come to public clarifying this, and I quote, "I think some of the pictures I've put on social media about what I've been eating happen to be on a low carb day, and I guess people see that and say he must be racing like that as well. I'm not. I believe in high carb, medium carb, and low carb." And this really was a result of the outstanding work performed by James Morton back on Team Sky. So coming down to what we were talking about, it really comes down to looking at the data, recognizing its limitations and applicability, and ultimately being able to adapt our practices to the current knowledge. And when talking about oxygen cost and oxygen delivery, there is a particular context in cycling that comes into my mind, and if Professor Trent Stellingwerff is listening to this, he already knows what I'm talking about. Cyclists often train and compete at altitude where oxygen availability is reduced. So I wonder if these effects of an increased oxygen cost of exercise would be exacerbated by racing at altitude.
Well, yes, that's a very good point, and I hadn't thought about it as clearly as that. But it does make sense to think that when you are in a more oxygen limited environment, that you do need to even be more economical with the fuel sources that you're using. And I think what you said before is really important, that you have to understand the limitations or the requirements of your event. And cycling's a really remarkable event, particularly the stage racing, because within the same competition there are so many different requirements for different stages. And James Morton has done some really lovely work with showing what Chris Froome does over something like the Giro d'Italia. the write-up of his remarkable win a couple of years ago, showing the different nutrition approaches for each of the different stages, where in some stages there was a lot of emphasis on carbohydrate for, very sustained high-intensity days, particularly, when he went off the front and rode by himself. But, in earlier parts of the race, there was concentration on lower carbohydrate intakes and lower energy intakes and low residue days, so that he would have ability to be able to conserve his effort and ride at a sort of a lower intensity on some of the days where it was, there were some hills where he needed to be as light as possible, or there were days that he was just sort of hiding in the pack and trying to save his energy, if you like. And so there were so many different ways in which nutrition was utilised in different ways to meet the requirements of what it would take to be successful on those days. And so cycling is a really lovely event in terms of being able to use a whole lot of different nutrition strategies and nutrition knowledge to get the ultimate podium win.
Absolutely. And one of the topics we said we would be touching later is the matter of returning to a high carbohydrate availability after adaptation to a ketogenic diet. And for this, let's consider a practical scenario. So a cyclist has a race ahead of him, a one-day race, and he's been using a ketogenic low-carb high-fat protocol during his training for several weeks prior to competition, and he's going to race soon. So we know that with only 5 days of low-carb high-fat diet, one can increase fat oxidation but impair carbohydrate oxidation, even with 1 day of carbohydrate loading. So how long before should this cyclist go back to a high carbohydrate diet in order to normalize his ability to optimally oxidize carbohydrate and perform at his best?
Well, we've just published another study. It's in press at the moment in JPhysiol, where we did look at the not time course of return, but we looked at putting another 5 days of high carbohydrate eating after the keto adaptation, and we found that by that 5 day mark there was a return to normal physiology and biochemistry in terms of fuel utilization. We don't have muscle biopsies to have a look at all the pathways to see if all the activities and amounts of the different transporters and parts of the fat utilisation pathway were completely restored, and whether the carbohydrate corollary had gone back to normal. But certainly within that 5 days, in terms of just looking at fuel substrate, it seemed to have returned to normal. And so we can say, well, it takes up to 5 days. We've got 24 hours where we saw that there was impairment of carbohydrate oxidation and some retention of the adaptation to the higher fat utilisation. So somewhere between 1 day and 5 days, that return to quote normal, if you like, happens. But at this stage, we can't pinpoint it any closer. It may be 2 days or 3 days if you're thinking about your athlete who wants to know when he might have to change back to high carbohydrate intakes to completely restore his ability to use them. But even with the 1 day of glycogen loading, even though we've seen impairment of carbohydrate utilisation, it probably is in some cases better than just staying on the ketogenic diet, depending on the requirements of the event that they're doing. There's a nice little case study that has come from Chris Webster from South Africa, who took a keto following ultra endurance athlete, a triathlete, who was interested to see whether the avoidance of carbohydrate was limiting his performance. And they did a nice little series of observations of what happens when he did a couple of times a week train with some carbohydrate being consumed during the exercise. So it wasn't restoring glycogen, but it was providing carbohydrate during the session. And he found that doing a couple of or three times a week of training with the higher carbohydrate intake for the higher intensity workouts that he was doing, when he then tried that in a performance angle, it showed an improvement in his ability to do exercise at the higher intensities at around the 80 to 90% of VO2 max It didn't improve his ability to do the very long kinds of more moderate intensity exercise, and it didn't help his ability to do very short, very high intensity exercise loads. But that area that we would have predicted from our work around the sort of the lactate threshold when you're working at your very highest rates of carbohydrate oxidation, there was improvement in performance of that kind of exercise. So even if your athlete decided on the day of the event to take in some carbohydrate, it probably would improve his performance compared to just being on the ketogenic diet at all if parts of his event required that kind of performance ability. But whether it's better than having been on a high carbohydrate approach or periodised carbohydrate approach where he'd maximised carbohydrate availability for key training sessions and then done it in competition all along, I'd predict that possibly the periodised approach would have been better than keto plus carbs on the day.
Well, I believe this is really what it comes down to see how a ketogenic diet plus carbohydrate loading performs compared to a periodized carbohydrate approach that really matches carbohydrate with the training intensity day by day, meal by meal, as Professor James Morton is fond of saying. And for the moment, not only for race day performance, but for enhancing training adaptation in the 6 months or so before competition, the periodized approach or fueling for the work required appears to show more robust evidence. And Professor Louise, since you've been really present in all these experiments, I wonder what can you tell us about the logistics and even the cost of implementing these different diets we've been talking about, a high carbohydrate diet, a periodized and a low carb, high fat ketogenic diet. And we've briefly touched on this when Ida Heikura was here on the podcast talking about diet periodization in cyclists, but we agree that this question would be much more suited to this episode with you. So what can you tell us about all the menu planning, all the logistics, and above all, the cost of these different diets for the athletes enrolled in the Supernova series?
Yeah. So the first thing is that the ketogenic diet is often very different to what people think about it. And you know, the what I call the average punter often, you know, reads a little bit or hears a little bit and then just imagines what the rest is. And we found with some of the athletes on our studies that they've been quite vocal in saying, oh, I've tried this myself at home, but now I see how you've done it. I realise that I didn't get anywhere close to what I should have been doing. It's actually quite difficult to construct a diet which is restricted in carbohydrate and protein and has very high fat intakes for people with high energy requirements, because the way people normally eat food or their food knowledge sometimes doesn't provide them with clever ways of constructing meals. We followed, as I said, the diet book that had been published by Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, and so we had some very good help to do it. But even so, when we're dealing with athletes who train very hard and have very high energy intakes, if you know you've got to restrict the carbohydrate and you can't increase protein too much, then it's quite difficult to find ways of just eating fat, because a lot of the foods that we think of have got a little bit of carbohydrate or protein in them, and so you have to restrict those, and then you have to think about, well, how do you eat fat if you're not eating it around protein or spreading it on carbs? It's quite difficult. So we think that a lot of people in everyday life who think they're following ketogenic diets really aren't quite meeting the targets. And the other thing that's kind of disappointing to me is that, you know, and this is not just about the ketogenic diet, but a lot of diets when they first become popular are based on some health advantages in that, you know, some of the nutrient dense foods and some of the health promoting aspects of food are preserved in these diets. But when they become really popular, people start cutting corners. Either they don't understand what the diet was really about and they just follow what they think's a good thing, or the food industry responds and produces things that sound like they're the same thing but are actually ultra-processed and don't have the same health benefits. And so just about any diet you can think of, and you can think about it for gluten-free diets, for vegan diets, for paleo diets and for keto diets, you'll find all these shortcuts that the food industry provides. And so you've now got keto ice cream and keto chocolate and, keto beer and keto everything. And so what started off as a diet based on real foods has now become fat bombs. And, it's really disappointing to me when I now see all these things that you can buy to be on a keto diet, and they're really ultra-processed things. And they might have high fat and low carbohydrate characteristics around them so that they kind of tick the boxes to be keto, but they're full of nothing. They're full of contrived artificial things, and some of the the good aspects of meats and dairy and fats have been completely removed. And so I think we've got to be careful with thinking that every ketogenic diet is the same, even though on paper it might meet the restrictions around carbohydrate and it might meet the fat targets. There's completely different ways of still doing that. And unfortunately, once things get popular, it seems to be a race to the bottom in terms of finding the worst way of being able to achieve it. So, I'm hoping that people who are on ketogenic diets stand up for themselves to promote the best of its opportunities rather than, letting the sort of the mass market pull it down to the bottom and reduce any of the health benefits that it could have.
I guess it's what they call dirty keto, as they say these days.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's now being promoted as if it's something wonderful to be on a dirty keto diet. You can't even do it properly. You just, you find ways of just eating fat bombs and contrived foods all day. So I really want to, try and, for those people who do want to follow the keto diet, really encourage that you do it properly and not just do the popular version of it.
I guess something similar happened with the paleo diet in the beginning, where it was all about natural, unprocessed foods, and then the market got invaded by all the paleo bars and caveman snacks. So it's kind of a flashback with what tends to happen with popular diets and just looking at business opportunities that may come from them. And you've just mentioned something important in your answer that I think it's important to emphasize for the listeners regarding the macros you've used to achieve ketosis in your studies, in particular protein. And it was perhaps my fault not to clarify this at the beginning of the episode. And there seem to be different ways of playing with the macros as long as the carbohydrates are kept under 50 grams or somewhere between 20 to 50 grams per day, with 60 to 75% of calories coming from fat and 15 to 30% coming from protein. But I still have questions regarding how high in protein you should go in order not to reduce or condition ketosis.
Look, I'm not an expert on this, but we've tried to follow the people who are expert on it, and we've tried to keep our fat intake higher. So in most cases, we're sort of 75 to 80% of energy coming from fat, and we've tried to keep the carbohydrate, as you said, to below 50 grams a day, and the protein to, up 15 to 20%. But we've tried not to go higher than that because of the possibility that the ketogenesis is reduced with the higher protein intakes.
And what if we're using amounts relative to body weight, let's say 2 grams per kilo as often recommended for some athletes? Would this amount interfere with ketosis?
Well, this is where it gets tricky because, if you've got athletes who are training with very high volumes and, when you start taking percentages of energy and then translating it into grams of the macronutrients, it's hard to know where to go. We've tried to keep ours to 2 grams per kilograms as protein and below, but when you've got really, really high volume training being done, then the need to increase energy intake from fat just becomes really impractical. I mean, you really are asking athletes to drink some oil or to have sort of unusual ways of getting their energy requirements just from very high fat sources.
Yummy. So, given everything that you've been presenting here so far regarding increased fat oxidation but impaired carbohydrate oxidation and decreased exercise economy, which at least in a competitive scenario can translate into decreased performance, do you consider that there is any particular context for the use of low-carb, high-fat diets throughout the season of an endurance athlete, perhaps as part of a periodized approach to maximize certain training adaptations, or whether in ultra-endurance events where intensity is lower, or even as a short-term strategy to promote fat loss in an athlete? I'm so sorry for teasing you, but this is it for part 1. Have you been enjoying it so far? Believe me when I say that the best is yet to come. On part 2, we will resume our talk and see in which scenarios Professor Louise believes a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet can be advantageous. In addition to that, and that's when things will get really interesting to me, we're going to be talking about the effects of following a ketogenic diet on the oral microbiome of elite athletes and also its effects on bone metabolism. Then there's a part I absolutely love. We're going to be asking Professor Louise the athletes' experiences while performing the experiments in the Supernova series. Have they started following a ketogenic diet after taking part in the experiments? We'll also be talking about the mediatized case of Evan Dunphy, the Canadian racewalker who took part in the study, and there will be even time to touch on exogenous ketones, so I am so excited to launch that episode. If you wish to be notified when part 2 is going to be launched, you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or even on Twitter by activating the notifications. Although I'm not very active, I do share and retweet studies of our research group and other research relevant for the context of this podcast. Once again, it would mean a lot and help the podcast grow if you could leave a comment and rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts. And if you think anyone might benefit from listening to this episode, be my guest and share it on social media, in particular on Twitter, where Fuel the Pedal is perhaps most active. Once again, thank you for being on that side and stay put for part 2. Stay safe, guys. Over and out.